And welcome to the sixth episode of P&P Diesel, where we discuss the metaphysical solutions to nihilism. Take it away, Per.
Um, well, basically, if existentialism is all about an overall, if it's so closely linked to absurdism and kind of appealing to an absurdity of the universe where there's no meaning to anything, and that where nihilism comes along with it is when you die, nothing in your life will matter as the millennia wash over your past existence. Right. And I'm trying to dispel that idea because I think it's so dangerous and defeatist, where you're not going to be able to ever make any significant moral or ethical progress under some mentality that is so counterintuitive to anything productive that it seems just so utterly defeated.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, yes. Okay. So what's kind of your argument then against that?
So if there's, I always kind of have a default heuristic of making everything very black and white. So if your only black and white binary options are either everything is meaningless or everything is 100% meaningful, I would 100% encourage you to think of everything as meaningful.
Why?
So that's what I'm trying to encourage.
Right. Why does that that level of like black and whiteness, why does that need to take place?
If you want to exist in gray areas, you can just start justifying really whatever you'd like. If you really start splitting hairs in the matter, it comes to everything that favors me is meaningful and everything that is unfavorable is meaningless. All the things that I don't like are meaningless. Helping other people and being altruistic. Oh, well, what's it going to matter in 1,000 years? It's all meaningless, But
Right.
as soon as I'm wronged, or as soon as I encounter an unfavorable circumstance, everything is meaningful. I just don't understand why you'd try to justify living in a gray area where you just kind of paint the picture as you'd like.
Right. And I think that so what's then the solution, or how would you convince someone to view everything as meaningful?
Well, see, this is where I have to brush up against some metaphysics, where you have to come along with me a little bit, but they're not outrageous assumptions.
Okay.
Because they are somewhat grounded in some physical proofs. Just theoretical physics. It just proves that I can't remember what law it is. But just the fact that given an infinite, this was some Einstein, given an infinite amount of time, infinite possibilities can arise,
Right.
Things like that. Right. So if you can come along with the fact that time is infinite.
Okay. So is that your first? I'm trying to kind of like write this out so I at least know what you're trying to get this out.
I'll present it that way.
Okay.
So if you give me the base assumption that time is infinite, I can do the rest from there.
Okay, time is infinite.
Right. So time is infinite, and basically, since you ended up here, you exist in time to begin with, right? It seems very self-evident as far as both of our understandings of time goes. In a linguistic kind of sense, even if that's a man-made kind of idea, we both seem to be existing at a period.
Okay.
Of existence.
So would you say the individual? So that would boil down to like the individual, or we know that the base assumption is the individual exists in time, or that we assume our like society or human beings in general exist in time.
The individual, because this argument is more centered around the individual.
Okay, individual exists in time.
But the individual as a concept, as the building block from which larger society and the larger concept of humanity is built on as a whole.
So it's
But
it's
I'm
not.
arguing
So
more
you're
on
thinking
an
of the
individual level.
you're thinking of the individual as in like the essence of the individual, not necessarily like me, the transcendent individual.
What do you mean essence versus transcendent exactly?
So like if the essence is
Is the essence Peter Lubenthal?
yes, so like the essence is Peter Lubenthal or Pearson Schwartz are the individual that exists in time versus me, the self realizing like consciousness. And
Right.
I probably didn't use those terms correctly. So it's the difference between like a person exists in time versus I, the being who understands his own, who can like it's not self actualization, but it's the self like reassuring, or like the Descartes individual, or is it like just a person?
I'd say more of the Cartesian I.
Okay.
But I guess the distinctions don't have to be so exact, because it all translates upward from that kind of starting point.
Right.
And the idea of translating upwards is a big factor in all of this, because we'll take it down to a subatomic kind of level where we're working with very fundamental building blocks. So
Okay.
if I'd argue that, and this is where larger, your kind of idea of essence versus a larger conscious self, kind of starts to be conflated. But the idea is that there's a certain amount of intelligence that exists in the makeup of the universe itself, and that's what allows for atoms and things to fall into the patterns and functions that they do. To form some kind of structural compound that follows a rigid and defined set of rules, following the principles and interacting according to the laws of physics and things, requires some intelligence. There's no exact definition of intelligence, but following a set of rules in that manner, would constitute intelligent behavior to some extent. So I'm putting forth the argument that even on a subatomic level, intelligence exists.
Okay.
Right. It doesn't have to be. It's not emergent of a larger, more complex being. The argument is that the larger complex being is only intelligent because the smaller the smaller components are intelligent in and of themselves. And this is the basis for my argument of consciousness as a larger picture.
Right.
You can't have intelligence without consciousness to some extent. They're inextricably linked. So you could basically what I'm trying to what I'm trying to argue is that you'd never build something that's conscious out of completely unconscious material. You'd never build something intelligent out of completely unintelligent material. Okay. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So from there, if you can agree with all that, it's pretty simple to just say, given an infinite amount of time in which an infinite amount of possibility can arise, if evolution and the process of evolution as it has started from, single cellular organisms made up of complex atomic structures, if that was able to happen once, it can happen again. And that's assuming that you'd have to revert all the way back to, literal prehistoric, single cell organisms, the very, very start of evolution itself.
Right.
This is not even taking into consideration, a planet where humans are a dominant species to begin with. That's how we got here to begin with. But going back to the picture of existentialism I've been talking about, if you think that when you die you just get to check out all of this, that's an enormous mistake, because there is already so much intelligent, and conscious life. It's the idea that maybe in like the African jungles, there's an entire there's an enormously quick turnover rate of like when an animal dies, every part of that animal is consumed by another animal or decompository function enormously quickly, like down to the bones. The lion will come along and eat a gazelle and take the meat, and then the hyenas will come along and take the bones, and then bacteria would decompose the rest, and this all happens within an incredibly quick amount of time.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing, the gazelle as an entity, is completely dissolved into different component parts down to an atomic level within maybe a day or so, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that the matter that made up that gazelle is translated into other beings, right? The lion takes part of it with it. The hyenas that eat the bones take part of it with it, right? All of those things, go somewhere else. And the picture I'm trying to paint is that the matter that once made up your body goes into different bodies and different functions. Right. And eventually through that cycle, I just used the example in an African setting because the turnover rate is very quick. And this will happen in any setting, just as following the second law of thermodynamics, the matter will always be recycled and repurposed somehow. The idea is just that at some point that matter will reconverge into a new type of being, whether it is just part of the lion at that point, having eaten the gazelle's meat,
or it can even stay as according to your argument, it can even stay as those like individual like molecules, and it would still technically be a being of intelligence.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. You can have this argument without having gone through the 2.3 billion years of evolution to get to this point where we have such complex organisms to begin with. I'm saying if you started this with literally nothing, no lions, no people, no fungus to decompose the rest, this would still occur to some extent, just if you're if you can accept that time is infinite, right? So just with where we're at now with so many different complex organisms, interacting with each other, it's much more likely that you're going to become part of one of those organisms and keep being recycled among those organisms in and of themselves, but on a larger scale, on a subatomic scale, I should say, rather. That's somewhat of an oxymoron. On a subatomic scale, in a larger frame of reference that disregards those animals, you'll still be something, right? Right. So the idea is just that, if existentialism is built on the idea that, time is infinite, all of my accomplishments are going to be null and void in 100 years. I'm never going to be anything. That's just so like, that's so egocentric and whiny to the current state of affairs. If you can accept that, it's almost like clinging to the Pearson Schwartz or clinging to the gazelle. And it's like, the gazelle died, but the purpose of its life isn't entirely null and void. The accomplishments might not be remembered, but it's not like it didn't serve a purpose and it didn't go on to serve other purposes in the future.
Yeah. My kind of.
So I just tried to flip existentialism on its head, just using that principle. If existentialism is all just about whining about how time passes everything by, if you can make yourself part of time itself, then nothing can pass you by.
Right. No, I would argue with like identity though. I think it's kind of like a step too great to ask people to identify with such a large scale process when it seems very intuitional that my only identity, or at least my baseline identity, isn't of like it. There are other things to which I identify to, but very largely, there are those very black and white lines of I am Peter Lubenthal, or like you were saying, like I am Pearson Schwartz, or I am the gazelle,
right.
And it doesn't. I don't think those identity boundaries are so easily pushed over just by saying, "Oh, I am of." Even if I do give you the point that you could say there is intelligence and consciousness in all things to varying degrees, and thus I come from that. It's still very obvious to me that there are identity lines surrounding me as an individual, and why would I choose to identify, or why would I identify in general with something that is outside those lines so closely?
Right. So, I mean, what I'd have to say to something like that is that there's no doubt that a strict and heavy existence bias has been selected for evolutionarily. The bias to continue existing as a black and white entity, as a Peter Lubenthal, as a gazelle, right? Because that's survivable. But I'd see this as somewhat of a naturalistic fallacy, where you're kind of appealing to I wouldn't say outdated kind of pictures, but the idea is that now you have evolved to a point where you have the capability to question these kind of things and think abstractly and make choices about these kind of things, and you're still desiring to hold on to a very animalistic thing that has been selected for you. I'm trying to get you to select something for yourself, and you're holding on to the idea that everything has been selected for you.
Right. I guess I'm just kind of this whole idea.
If you can theorize that if you can if you can convincingly theorize to yourself that there are other options other than existing as Pearson, Schwartz, Peter Lubenthal, and you can believe those yourself, I think that would be enormously to your favor than just thinking that when I die, this is it. I'm only ever going to be Pearson, Schwartz. I don't know why you want to hold on to that.
Right. And so kind of my pushback on that, though, is I think you're unwittingly kind of buying in to this idea of this kind of you're buying into the idea of Pearson Schwartz, because in some way you are saying, I think any version of morality, or any version of something saying this is right or wrong, or as this any appeal to right action automatically buys in the idea of this very black and white entity, aka Pearson Schwartz, aka Peter Lubenthal, aka the gazelle, just on the basis
of themselves,
right?
Things as entities to begin with, making the ethical claim that you shouldn't mistreat things, carries with it implicitly the idea that there are, defined and separate things that treat each other,
and that
is that what you're arguing?
Yeah, and that you are those an entity that could, in some way, impact the environment around us or around you, and that you yourself have any moral responsibility over the control of that given entity. So in that way, I think you're buying into it, and it doesn't seem like one can, without totally, I don't think you can buy into your type of this idea that, or knock down those identity boundaries, because in the argument to say, oh, you should knock down these identity boundaries, you yourself are supplanting the idea that identity exists in the first place by making those moral claims.
Yeah. So it has certainly been a challenge to try to fit morality and ethics into this picture. and maybe it's continuing down a road that's going to lead me to a more Aurelian stoicism of some kind about the way things are, and maybe some Western Taoism, But the idea is that the idea that has been more challenging to me, that's a good point. But the idea that's challenged ethics in this picture to begin with is more the infinite possibilities.
What do you mean by that?
In my opinion, for every moral, in a system where there are infinite possibilities, and those infinite possibilities will eventually happen, will be enacted. Every moral choice you make in one life, in one instance, will theoretically be negated in another life in which you, as a separate entity, millions of years down the road, reconvene, living the same life, will make the opposite choice, and that moral progress will somehow be negated. Right? That's the problem that I've run into more than the entities themselves being inseparable from an idea of.
Well, I would kind of push back is, why do we feel like we have to identify or somehow claim that anything beyond this identity in which I can intuitionally embody right now is belongs to me, right? So you could say, well, in an infinite world, there's going to be infinite people like me, but is that thing me? Or why do you insist on saying, or why do you think that we have to identify with those? Those things?
I guess I think you might be misunderstanding me a little bit.
Okay.
I guess I wasn't saying. I didn't want to make it so specific to the acting character being the same as much as the point was that the action was committed as a negation of the previous moral action.
Right.
It was just a point about the immorality. The moral progress that was once made was defeated, and vice versa. Eventually, the moral progress that was defeated will be restored. It just in the infinite scope of things, all of those possibilities will eventually come to fruition.
Yeah, so to me, I guess I'm not falling to how this kind of links into your argument against kind of this nihilism.
Oh, right. So that's been the problem that I've been working on.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So that's something you have been working against.
Yeah, that's just something that's been worrying me.
Okay.
But the picture of nihilism is so it comes down to, there was a really interesting argument that Sam Harris had with Jordan Peterson over the definition of truth, right? And Jordan really was fervent in his argument that truth was only to be nestled in a Darwinian and non I don't want to say non-strictly logical sense, but truth in his picture was really just what was evolutionarily true.
Right.
Right. So the idea was that you couldn't make value judgments based just on the science of the things. You had to make them, the value judgment was always nestled in its moral worth to the evolutionary front. So he begins just by accusing Sam of not being sufficiently Darwinian.
Okay.
And he says, your definition of truth isn't linked to these evolutionary factors as closely as it ought to be. And they go on some crazy debate about the whole thing. But the idea was just that was truth. The question they really got stuck on was like a disease that had the potential to render humanity extinct. And the point was it true that we should have discovered the disease, or was it? I'm trying to remember how the argument actually went. But it was all linked to survivability and evolutionary factors.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So basically, the idea is it can only be true in this sense, or it can only be moral when in the context of like the evolutionary struggle to find things that are like survivable.
Yeah. So a survivable concept was only a concept that was useful. Well, that's what I'm trying to say. And
thus the survivability equals truth, or they're in some way equated. Is that what you're saying?
Well, so that's one side of the argument. A better example, I won't use the disease one because I can't quite remember how it went. The better example was that 2 + 2 = 4, not because of a strictly, Sam would argue that it's scientifically and logically necessary for that to be true. But Jordan would go one step behind that and say that that is only necessary and logically true because evolution demands things to be logically and necessarily true as a useful heuristic. It's only true because it's useful to have math that is true to us.
Right.
There's no truth outside of its use to the species in the first place.
Okay. And so
2 + 2 only = 4 because if it didn't, things would make less sense and ultimately be less likely to survive.
Do you think you agree? Do you agree with that then?
Well, so here's where I'm going with this nihilism, right? Where if you're going to agree with that definition of a relative truth like that, right, where everything is relative to an idea of evolutionary value, right? Darwinian, nestled in a Darwinian picture of survivability and usefulness defined in that regard. If you can agree to that, an idea of nihilism being true is so counterintuitive to the idea of the thing. If you walk around believing that your life is meaningless, and you make that a personal truth, that's not going to necessarily lead you to
unsurvivable
to any
belief.
It's just not a survivable idea.
Right.
So it's hard to argue for the truth of something like nihilism, just from a definition of truth in that regard. Where it's not necessarily useful, so I don't know why you'd use it as true.
Right. So, but if you can like peel back kind of this idea of usefulness and truth being or usefulness being the ultimate arbiter of truth, do you think still that regardless of something like is true or not, or regardless of something is useful or not, it ultimately stands up to the test of is that thing in fact, or like the nihilist would say, like you can kind of throw usefulness out the window because immediately when you peel back the idea of evolution as kind of this short process in the billions upon billions of years that this universe has existed, it really the usefulness to life really doesn't equal truth when it comes to trying to discover a metaphysics of like how or in what state the universe exists, right?
I'm not sure if I understand you.
So like if I would argue against the idea that truth in and of itself needs to be equated with usefulness? Or why does that seem, or why do you think that's such like a necessary connection, given the fact that we are, yeah. So I guess that's the question.
I think I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I'm strictly relating this to the existentialist and nihilist kind of picture of things.
Okay.
Where I'd argue that from an evolutionary standpoint, those kind of views are just so defeated by a survivalistic bias that you can never truly live them. If you truly believe that your life is, I say truly here almost ironically, but if you understand your life to be meaningless and actually take up like a nihilistic standpoint that life has no value, all your actions are meaningless and the time will wash you over. It doesn't matter how long you live. Your life, there actually isn't any point in eating your next meal. If it all actually is meaningless, why would you eat the meal in the first place?
Right.
So, but your biological hardware that you're running off of these billions of years of evolutionary selection doesn't allow you not to eat that meal. So you're almost living an entirely conflicted and enslaved life.
There's so much
evolutionary principles, right? Where you're not living a truth, where it's you're holding one belief in your head. You're just living in such a state of cognitive dissonance that to claim that you're not is just evolutionarily not true.
Right. And so I think that's kind of like the biggest. I think the biggest takeaway from this is that this like nihilism does in fact produce such cognitive dissonance that basically it's just an untenable idea. And the question is, I mean, nihilism is like logically, I think, such a convincing idea. Or on its surface is such
maybe for pessimists,
right. But it is such like it is such an appealing idea to someone who looks at the universe and says, in such great vastness, how could I matter at all, right? And it seems like a very obvious thing to say if we're not doing what we're doing here, and kind of going through the arguments and really deeply thinking about it. But so then these are the responses to kind of those easily put together logical arguments of time is infinite, I myself, nothing matters, and what is life worth anyway? And instead, that's what we're trying to do, is offer that solution to those kind of easily accepted arguments. And so you're saying that because time is infinite and because we are merely products of this intelligence that exists inside all things, and this consciousness that exists inside all things, that we can truly feel kind of connected to the rest of the universe in the fact that, and then you have a responsibility, or like you matter because of that.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is that if you can agree that, let me see here. How do I want to put it? So you say, well, like why not? Well, why worry about it? I'm gonna die. My legacy is gonna be forgotten, right? If you can just agree that, because I make a part of an infinite universe, therefore whatever I am made up of is also infinite. I myself am infinite. Just in that I'm part of the universe that is infinite, right? You can't have something that's infinite made up of non-infinite things.
Right.
Right. And I don't think that's a huge jump to make, and an unreasonable bridge to gap to bridge.
No, I don't think at all. And I guess I would push back on some. I mean, these are kind of like maybe arguments for another day, but the whole idea of I don't think necessarily. I think the way we conceptualize time as like infinite, right, is very kind of forced upon us by just I think the way we are not programmed by any means, but the way our kind of maybe because of some of these philosophers, we're kind of forced into this idea of like time is infinite or all these things, and regardless of okay, maybe that, and I think if we shorten down, and this probably is an argument for another day, I don't think we necessarily need to conceptualize time as infinite, or I feel like that's, I don't know, I think, it's kind of stumbling here, but I don't necessarily agree that necessarily time needs to be infinite, nor do I agree that another one of your base arguments that this infinite universe needs to have intelligence in it, or we are in any way need to associate ourselves with it in order to find like that meaning that would like push back on nihilism. But that may be an argument for a separate day. And I can kind of bring up, in the next one, I think I can kind of bring up my kind of...
Yeah, I'd have to work on that for a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've done my piece to explain why existentialism is useless, garbage, putrid filth, stench, bubbling to the pit of a rancid cesspool of hopelessness and defeatism. What have you come to find?
So I think my general idea is kind of explain this kind of last episode, but this whole idea that when I'm very much of the belief that like intuition will get you farther than I think a lot of other modes of thinking. And so, like I've kind of said before, I think we need to start, if you can like imagine like a circle. And in that circle are things simply that you can find that you are intuitionally like it is unimaginable that those things could not be true, right? Like if whatever that mechanism by which you decide something is intuitionally correct or incorrect, that it just seems like those things are true. Like, and I would argue that those two things are this idea that I am an entity that is like transcendent, and in transcendent I mean I realize my own essence, and because of that, and also that free will is then a part of that transcendence because of the realization of my place in the universe and the ability to act. And so I would argue that it almost doesn't even make sense to kind of spread beyond those two things to make an argument against this like nihilistic viewpoint, because you really like shorten down the time span that you need to think about all of these things on. So instead of me in the realization that the universe that exists is billions upon billions of years or whatever current science may tell us, it really highlights my life or the things I can intuitionally gather as being part of my identity are those things that are basically, to me, consist, all those things are things that make up like eternity for me, right? So, and then in that, I can branch out from there and say, okay, well, I've got this consciousness, and this thing must be operating inside some sort of setting, right? And so that setting is kind of if you can think of the consciousness as like a hoop, and then those things that you are viewing, or I'm trying to kind of simplify this as best I can. So kind of forget I said that. If that consciousness is all you really need to think about, and then that automatically highlights your free will and your decisions as things that are meaningful, and therefore should be of the utmost consideration when talking about things of like morality and things such as that. So you should be kind of gathering all your intuitional resources or your logical resources in finding those things that are morally responsible to do, because we've kind of shortened down this time spent to just your life, and to decide that, well, these are the only thing, these decisions that I make are really the only things that matter, and therefore it is upon me to go out and attempt to find the moral truth or the morally correct path in that aspect. And I think when you take it this way,
this is all an argument for some value you can find in existentialism, right?
Right. And so because I think the real
I got you. I understand.
Right. And I think the real danger to existentialism is this idea of passivity towards your life or your environment. And I think that passivity allows you, right? It's no longer this extreme ownership of your life. It's this idea that I can kind of ignore what I'm doing, and I can allow things to pass because it didn't matter, and it didn't matter anyway. And so this implies some extreme ownership over that morality, and is worthy of your attention at all times, right? Because you are, in some sense, all that exists intuitionally to yourself, and therefore you need to find that moral path.
Yeah, no, there's a great, just speaking about what you were mentioning before about meaning. If I understood where you're going to go with what you're saying about the hoop of consciousness, kind of highlighting, almost just circling what matters to you as a relative being and to those around you, your direct circle of family and friends.
Right.
If those are all highlighted and that's where the meaning lies, that is certainly an effective scale. There's a great Jordan quote where he says, a school bus full of children is blown up, and the existentialist says, it's meaningless, and in 1,000 years no one will remember it. It's all meaningless. He basically just says that seems like the wrong scale to take. That certainly doesn't seem like a meaningless event. Because it certainly had impact on those families whose children were on that bus. Things like that, all of their friends, everything. There was meaning in all of those relationships. But just stepping back to say, in 10,000 years, it's not going to mean anything. That just seems like an ineffective way to approach a problem like that.
Right.
Right.
And so when you talk about, I want to make it very clear that I'm not necessarily saying.
Right. You see, you in this way, you've given me a way that I can.
Right.
Work morality into my infinite scale.
Right. So I'm not necessarily saying that the one needs to, or that given this kind of like hoop of consciousness, and I'm not saying hoop of consciousness from the standpoint like a scale.
Do you mean like
to which one?
Like a circle? Like which thing? Like you're talking about like highlighted things. Do you just mean like the circle of things which matter to you?
No. When I conceptualize kind of like the hoop of consciousness, it's literally like when you think of a hoop, and if you can think of like
thinking of a hula hoop,
like a hula hoop, and basically a river is kind of like flowing through the hoop, and so if you can say, and kind of like atop the hoop, kind of looking backwards towards the direction the current is flowing, not towards the direction that the current is flowing to, not from, is kind of this idea is placed like an eye or something to that extent. And so if you can imagine the individual as someone who is as this hoop and that eye, and basically this idea of events or whatever objective reality kind of flows through this hoop, and these events are then not, I wouldn't say created, but are in some sense kind of brought into meaningful being by this hoop and this eye, and from that flows, and then you can say, okay, well, what about this hoop? If this hoop is us, and it looks upon objective morality, and we are the thing that kind of brings objective morality or objective reality into existence, from this sense, existence to us, the object, or no, this, how does that work? The subject, we are bringing that into objective reality. We can then instantiate that is kind of the only thing, and I kind of need to discuss this better, but it's the idea that that is the only thing that really then the scale, or the only scale we should really consider, is those things that we can, in some sense, bring to light, right? Because otherwise, there's no confidence that anything besides that either exists or is of any importance. And so then you can look through that and say, well, it not only brings value to the things that are surrounding us, but it also brings value to us as an individual being the thing that that kind of the scale we should look at. So you're saying, okay, so this, you as an individual can't really look effectively or truly on anything that you can't see. And so if you can't see, I'm kind of losing track of my argument here. I kind of need to write this out or something like that. But it's this idea that anything that flows through that hoop is of great importance, and therefore is, or I need to re-explain this. I gotta have a couple of days.
You're quite the visual painter,
right?
If I understand you correctly, it sounds like you're describing a picture, that includes an idea of relativity, where you have like a Pythagoras, the man is the measure of all things kind of scenario. That is the hoop where man is measuring all of the things, but it's not entirely relative, because the flow of that stream passing through the hoop is the objective picture to begin with, from which you're extracting anything that has relative meaning. Is that accurate?
No, yes. And
that's where I would introduce my idea of God, right? Where God is that idea of the objective flow of everything going through. Even if you can't comprehend all of it, even if you don't notice all of it, even if your relative spectrum of light that is visible to you is only these colors and these bandwidths, that objective picture of all of the bandwidth still exists and flows through, right?
Right.
All of those things still flow through. And that's where I need God as a divine facilitator of all of those things. And that's an interesting part that I have to work into my picture of all things. But I think I understand what you're talking about, this hoop and this flow of events going through it.
Right. And I think because this hoop is intuitively linked with some sort of like free will or ability to change the flow, I think it is necessarily... I think that's where I'm kind of gathering a sense of like morality, not from the standpoint that each hoop encounters the same flow or each hoop is dealt with exactly the same kind of current conditions. It's still a fact that the hoop can change the current, right? It's not that these hoops are kind of like unable, or any hoop is unable to change the current, in a sense that we are all.
They're not separate from each other. They're able to interact.
Right. Well, not necessarily that they're able to interact, but that even if you had a single hoop, the objective reality kind of flows through that and is affected by the hoop. This would be the effects of any moral decisions we have to make. And from that, you can say, okay, well, I have not proven necessarily the right way to change that current, but I've proven that I can, in fact, change the current. And from that, you can say, well, then you just have supplanted the idea of morality, because you have this power or this free will to change that current, and therefore this gives your life meaning, right? Just for the mere fact that you can, because you are that object, or that is able to change, or is able to decide things. It proves that morality exists and therefore meaning exists, regardless of the fact. And then you don't even have to necessarily. There's no further kind of discovery of what the right decision is to make, to not to kind of realize that there is decisions being made and there is kind of meaning there.
Yeah. I mean, so if I'm understanding all of you correctly, you just pose questions like, does it appear to your perception that you can cause an effect in the world? You know, can you affect your enacting a physical action? You're throwing a dart at a dartboard. Can you affect a dart to travel towards a dartboard?
Yeah.
You say yes, and then can you make judgments about the effects that you just enacted? Right.
Right.
Can you say, I threw it and it hit the bullseye, or can you say I threw it and it was miserably off mark and it hit the wall?
Right.
You know, nothing about that bullseye necessarily makes it true or anything besides you deciding that that's the nature of the game. But you still threw the dart and made a judgment about it and set up those rules.
Right. And so then I like that dartboard kind of analogy. But yeah, and so because of that, the throwing of the dart and the action that or the effect that has on the world, I think we can intuitionally say from that, you can say, well, I think that's all the meaning that you can need to drag out of the world in order to kind of defeat these ideas of like these nihilistic ideas.
I mean, in the same way that you threw the dart at the dartboard and it hit it, and there was meaning in what you observed there. You know, in the same way that the dart was thrown. You know, going back to the bus example, a bomb was thrown at the bus, and there was a result as a cause of that bomb being thrown at the bus, and there are judgments to be made about that, and all of those are real consequences in the objective reality that's occurring, and there's judgments to be made about those.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's where I would say just the mere fact that you can draw that conclusion that I have an effect in the world, and I think that kind of defeats nihilism.
That's a powerful conclusion.
Because, I mean, one can say that, I mean, it's kind of pointless to go further from there, because you have just seen, like, you have an objective effect on the world, and therefore from that instantiates meaning regardless of, and I think when people blow it up to this infinite scale, I think it's just a matter of like perception of the problem. Like you're not taking away the fact that you have an effect on reality. And I think it's kind of like a lazy way to say, oh, everything's huge and it doesn't matter. Well, that's not necessarily, like, you can definitely visualize it like that. But I don't think that's
you got the wrong scale, bucko. It's not helpful.
Yeah. So that would be my argument.
Yeah. Oh, what a load. Existentialists are lazy.
What a load. I feel like we're kind of simplifying their arguments, though. I feel like there's a lot more there.
Say it again?
I feel like we're simplifying their arguments. I feel like there might be a lot more there than just this idea that...
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, we haven't really touched much on the absurdism of the whole thing. But
Right.
I think it's relevant to the relativity where it's you take something that from any other. My biggest problem with absurdism is that it's absurdist from a relative point where it's you somehow take in oxygen molecules into your lungs and somehow that allows you to continue living.
Such an absurd.
Somehow I pick leaves off this tree and I eat them and that's good for me. It's like, yeah, of course all of that sounds absurd, but you're still working, you're stepping back and disembodying yourself as if, you're not, in any relative position.
Yeah.
It's only absurd because you're not a human anymore. Humans run on oxygen and biomatter that is consumable.
Yeah. And I think that's
my biggest problem with absurdism, where it's, yeah, of course, everything's going to be absurd if you disembody yourself.
Right.
That's a large part of existentialism, but that works into the point where it's just you have the wrong scale again.
Yeah.
Yes, everything's going to seem absurd, but.
No, I 100% agree. And it's like it's this idea that you're disembodying yourself, but you're not really. You think you are. And then you're still, as this disembodied, embodied human, you're still able to make claims about something when you never really left the body in the first place. Like you imagine it to be absurd, but why are you don't have all the knowledge in the universe? What if even if you are disembodied, it makes perfect sense why this is brown or something like that. I don't know. It's just like, it's a very, I think, arrogant point of view.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's using your abstract thinking to laugh at abstract thinking while you're the one doing it in the first
Right.
place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's just like, I don't know what you're actually trying to do.
Right.
I really don't.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to leave off. I think,
yeah, should we call it? That's got to be just about an hour.
I was looking at all the life. There were plants and birds and rocks and things. There was sand and hills and rain. The first thing I met was a fly with the bugs and the sky with no clouds. The heat was hot and the ground was dry.